Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on the importance of diversity and inclusion in the workplace. I wanted to share my thoughts with you on this important topic and tell you that it is a fundamental part of how the Bureau looks at how we do our work. Diverse backgrounds, perspectives, experiences bring a lot to bear to any organization. And in fact, it's proven that diversity and inclusion enhance business performance. I'm sure it's something you're looking at in your organization as well. I'd like to also note our self-assessment process that we have available for you as a framework to think about diversity and inclusion in your organization. Thank you again for joining us today and look forward to continued cooperation and collaboration on this important topic.
Hello, I'm Lora McCray, Director of the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion here at the CFPB. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to take you all through a presentation that provides an overview of the voluntary diversity self-assessment process that CFPB is inviting entities that we regulate to participate in this fall. Let's review the agenda. First, we'll go over the background of the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion and Section 342 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which governs the OMWI activities. Then we'll review the joint standards for assessing diversity and inclusion practices of regulated entities developed by the federal financial regulatory agencies and the voluntary self-assessment process that we'll be using. Finally, we'll discuss some frequently asked questions that we expect to arise, and we'll close by providing contact information for the OMWI team here at CFPB. So the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion, as part of the Dodd-Frank Act, these offices were created for the federal financial regulatory agencies. They have both internal and external responsibilities. Internally, the OMWIs ensure that diversity and inclusion is prioritized as it relates to workforce and workplace policies, contractor workforce, and also agency suppliers. Externally, the OMWIs are tasked with assessing the diversity policies and practices of the entities we regulate. The OMWI mission is to develop and foster a diverse, inclusive workforce, a work environment informed by best practices in diversity and inclusion, in which employees have equal access to opportunities and are valued at their expertise and authentic perspectives. So to provide, the purpose of the OMWIs is to provide strategic direction on innovative diversity and inclusion practices in all Bureau mission-focused activities and to the financial industry for the benefit of the American consumer. The Dodd-Frank Act, Section 342 of the Dodd-Frank Act, establishes the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion. The Act sets forth that each financial federal regulatory agency must have an OMWI office. It also sets forth the duties of those offices, which include equal opportunity in terms of racial, ethnic, and gender diversity for the workforce and for the senior management of the agency. It includes increasing participation of minority and women-owned businesses in programs and contracts for the agency, and it includes assessing the diversity policies and practices of entities regulated by the agency. One thing to note is that the law does not mandate any specific actions as a result of the assessment. The assessment is separate from any supervisory or enforcement processes. So you might ask, why assess diversity and inclusion within financial services? And first of all, it's a requirement under Dodd-Frank Section 342. So it's the law. Also, to understand the demographic diversity within financial services industry. Another reason to assess the diversity practices is to encourage financial institutions to provide products and services to a broader range of consumers and to do business with a broader range of businesses, including those in underserved communities. We also want to encourage hiring, retention, and promotion of minorities and within financial services, and finally, to reduce incidences of discriminatory practices within financial services. The voluntary self-assessment process derives from the joint standards developed by the federal financial regulatory agencies. In June of 2015, the OMWI directors of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the Comptroller of the Currency, the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the National Credit Union Association, and the Securities and Exchange Commission all finalized an interagency policy establishing joint standards for assessing the diversity policies and practices of entities that the agencies regulate. These standards provide a framework for advancing workforce and supplier diversity based on leading practices. The standards focus on 5 major areas: organizational commitment, workforce profile and employment practices, procurement and business practices, practices to promote transparency, and entity self-assessment. So we'll come back to the standards in a little while. But first, let's talk about this process. One question you might ask is, why should entities participate? Entities benefit from using the assessment tool to analyze their diversity programming. It's important that entities participate in this process to understand all the components necessary for a successful diversity and inclusion program, to identify potential gaps within their diversity and inclusion programming, to learn how their peers are doing within the space, including common challenges, to understand the state of diversity and inclusion within the financial services industry as a whole, and also to learn about successful diversity and inclusion programs and to share best practices. In terms of the process that we're discussing today, I wanted to let you know where CFPB will be focusing our efforts. Over the next several months, we'll conduct outreach to industry groups and trade associations. We are also going to conduct outreach directly to entities and institutions that we regulate. We'll collect and review self-assessments. We'll then aggregate that data and report it to Congress. The information will be included in our annual report to Congress as a part of our overall reporting on our progress under Dodd-Frank Section 342. We'll also share best practices that we identify from the data that we've collected, and throughout the process, we'll be providing support and resources to entities for improving their programs. The self-assessment form, there are a few things that you should know about it. First of all, it's voluntary. That's very important. This is a voluntary self-assessment process that we hope all entities we reach out to will participate in. The self-assessment is also an effective tool for evaluating your diversity and inclusion programming. It's simple and brief, only 34 questions, and we'll be requesting responses by the end of December for each calendar year. Let's go over the form. The form has 4 main components. Organizational information, as you can see from the slide, that includes basic things like the institution's address, the period of time that you'll be reporting in the form, when you're submitting it. Key is who your diversity and inclusion contacts are, and also a contact for supplier diversity. The second section is diversity policies and practices, and it looks at information about internal policies that demonstrate organizational commitment. It includes things like diversity inclusion training, whether the organization has a diversity policy, any progress reports you do on diversity and inclusion, and who your diversity and inclusion leader is in the organization. The third section of the report of the form deals with diversity data, and that falls into 2 buckets. First is workforce, and that looks at the numbers and percentages of women and minorities in the total workforce of the organization, and looking at all levels, all the way up to senior and executive levels. The second bucket is procurement and supplier diversity, and that looks at the total annual procurement spend with minority and women-owned businesses compared with the total procurement spend with all vendors. The fourth section of the form it provides for the submission of additional information. And this can be any type of any other information or comments that the entity wants to share about their diversity policies and practices. For example, an entity could include their EEO-1 statements, an affirmative action plan, or any other policy or program documents that they think would be useful. So the self-assessment form is a tie back to the joint standards that I referenced earlier. And I wanted to take some time to take a closer look at those standards now. So the first standard deals with organizational commitment to diversity and inclusion. And under this standard, the entity can include, the entity would include any diversity inclusion considerations in both their employment and contracting. For example, if they have a strategic plan for recruiting, hiring, and retention, if the entity has a diversity inclusion policy, if the entity provides regular progress reports to their board or senior management on diversity and inclusion. The standard also looks at whether the entity conducts training on diversity and inclusion, and whether the entity takes proactive steps to promote diverse pools of candidates in their hiring, retention, and recruitment. The second standard is the workforce profile and employment practices. This standard looks at how the entity implements policies and practices related to workforce diversity and inclusion in a way that complies with applicable laws. And it looks at how the entity, does the entity ensure equal employment opportunity for their employees, and whether it does not engage in unlawful employment discrimination. The standard also looks at the entity's policies and practices that create diverse applicant pools, considering things like outreach to minority and women organizations, outreach to educational institutions, participation in conferences and workshops. This standard also looks at how an entity, if an entity uses both quantitative and qualitative measures to assess its workforce diversity and inclusion efforts. And finally, under this standard, we look at how the entity holds management. Does the entity hold management accountable for diversity and inclusion at all levels of the organization? The third standard deals with procurement and business practices or supplier diversity. Under this standard, we look at whether the entity has a supplier diversity policy, if the entity has methods to evaluate its supplier diversity, and that could include different metrics like annual spending, maybe the percentage of contract dollars that are awarded to minorities and women, percentage of contracts with minority and women-owned businesses and subcontractors. And the standard also looks at the entity, if the entity has practices to promote a supplier diversity pool, which could include things like outreach to minority and women-owned contractors, participation in supplier diversity conferences and workshops, and an ongoing effort to publicize opportunities. The fourth standard is practices to promote transparency of organizational diversity and inclusion. And under this standard, we look at whether the entity is transparent with respect to its diversity and inclusion activities, looking at things like, does the entity have a diversity and inclusion strategic plan? Does the entity have a policy on its commitment to diversity and inclusion? Does the entity's progress toward achieving diversity and inclusion in its workforce and procurement activities, do they publicize that progress? And we also look at opportunities at the entity to promote diversity. And that can include things like current employment and procurement opportunities, forecasts for future employment and procurement opportunities, and the availability to use things like mentorship, development programs for employees and contractors. The fifth standard is called entity self-assessment, And this really looks at how the entity examines itself and measures itself on diversity and inclusion. That we look at whether the entity uses standards of conduct of self-assessment for its diversity inclusion practices. How does it look at those? Does it measure them annually? Whether the entity monitors and evaluates its performance on diversity and inclusion on an ongoing basis. The standard looks at whether the entity provides information pertaining to their self-assessments of diversity policies and practices to its OMWI director and to the primary federal financial regulator, and whether the entity publishes information pertaining to its efforts with respect to these standards, and that might include something like publishing an annual diversity report. So at this point, let's talk about some of the questions that you may have. First of all, one question that we expect would come to mind is how are the agencies handling overlapping jurisdictions with other FIREAs? So each federal financial regulatory agency is requesting self-assessments from the entity that they are primarily responsible for regulating. Where there is overlap, an entity can provide the same information to both regulators. We don't want to create any extra work or burden for the entities, but we would like to get the information so that we can look within the industry. We have that information to include as we look across the industry. Another question, how do we plan to report the information to Congress? We will aggregate the data and include it in our annual report to Congress as showing any overall trends that we see from the data, but we will not be reporting information on individual organizations. How is the Bureau handling FOIA requests for information? If a FOIA request is made regarding a regulated entity's information, CFPB's FOIA personnel will follow the process described in the CFPB regulations, 12 CFR Part 1070, which includes informing the regulated entity of the request and giving the entity the opportunity to justify that the material should be withheld. So what is the plan for providing technical assistance and support to institutions? We'll send out guidance on completing the self-assessment along with the invitation to participate. We'll also post that guidance on the website with the self-assessment form. Entities can also reach out to us with any questions at our email address, cfpb_regulatedentity@cfpb.gov. And one last question, will the Bureau engage in enforcement actions or other regulatory activities as a result of the entity's diversity programming? The answer to this is this emphatic no. This process is separate from our supervision and enforcement. So to wrap things up, the key contacts for questions on the diversity self-assessments are myself, Lora McCray. You can see both my email and my phone number on the slide. Also, Rhonda Johnson, who's a senior advisor in our OMWI office and a point person for our work with regulated entities. And finally, if you have inquiries, you can direct them to cfpb_regulatedentity@cfpb.gov, and we will be happy to respond to your questions. In closing, I want to thank you for your time. We hope you find this webinar informative, and please don't hesitate to contact us if you have a question.